Tuscany, a region in central Italy known for some years by everybody from under the Tuscan sun, is the best representative of the character of Italy. Due to its location, it's a transition between north and south. Still, its landscape is so unique that the term Tuscan landscape is used worldwide to describe the natural wonder in which undulating hills dressed in bright green, moderate elevations and gentle slopes alternate, and vineyards and olive groves flourish on them. This landscape is made colorful by sunflower fields and violet-colored lavender gardens. Along the roads leading to antique villas, slender cypresses rise like exclamation marks. As in Maeterlinck's metaphor, they rise into the sky like a flaming dark prayer. The crests are girdled with gray castle walls. The slender belfries of churches stand out among the thick stone buildings. Tuscany has enough literature to fill a library since artists, including writers, have always adored this land. That's why we may think we know everything about it, but there are few places in the world where there are so many things to discover. The cuisine of Italy, which of course includes Tuscany, is known to be good. Of course, we can eat pizza and pasta here, but there are a lot of other possibilities too. Private inns and chefs of trattorias spoil everybody. The region is famous for its locally produced olive oil, sheep's cheese from the southern meadows, fresh herbs, and white and red wines of the hills, Chianti, Brunello, and Vernaccia, in their straw-covered bottles. Florence is the cradle of the Renaissance and one of the cultural centers of Europe. The capital of Tuscany may be the city richest in art monuments. Here lived Dante, Petrarca, and Boccaccio. The names of the greatest painters, sculptors, and architects have become one with the city. Leonardo and Michelangelo, Giotto, Donatello, Raffaello, Botticelli, Vasari, and Cellini all worked here. The most famous buildings of the city can be found in the Old City on the right bank of the Arno River. Two squares are entwined here: Piazza San Giovanni, where the baptistry stands, and Piazza del Duomo, where the cathedral and the belfry can be found. It was the center of the settlement even in the Roman era. During that time, it was surrounded by a wall. The cityscape reminds us more or less of the one in the Renaissance, although the Jewish ghetto has been liquidated and the archiepiscopal palace has been removed. Despite this, the two intertwined squares suggest a medieval atmosphere even now. The official name of the cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, refers to the lily in the coat of arms of the city, and the legend that Florence was originally established in a flowery field. That's why it was called the City of the Flowers for a long time. Churches at that time were never finished in 1 or 2 years. Successive master builders often didn't live to see the finished building. Giorgio Vasari, an architect and painter born in Tuscany, was made famous by his biographies of Renaissance artists. In his book, he describes the disputes and intrigues emerging during the construction of the cathedral. The building was begun in 1296 by Arnolfo di Cambio. After his death, Giotto and Andrea Pisano continued his work, but both considered the building of the belfry more of a challenge. The appearance of Francesco Talenti gave new life to the work, but the planned construction of the huge dome still proposed problems. Finally, this problem was solved by Brunelleschi, who had the 107-meter-high dome built without a scaffold. The total floor space of the monumental dome is 17,500 square meters. The octagonal baptistry named after St. John the Baptist, in Italian Battistero, may be the oldest building of Florence standing today. The world-famous bronze gates come from the 14th century. The southern gate is a masterpiece made by Andrea Pisano. The reliefs depict scenes from the eponymous saint's life. The northern and the eastern gate and gilded frame of all 3 gates were made by Ghiberti in his own workshop. He had won the commission by tender, and not only the town council was satisfied with the results. Michelangelo said about the eastern gate looking onto the cathedral that it would be worthy of being the gate to paradise. The work has been called Porta del Paradiso since then. In 1265, Dante was baptized in the chapel used as a Roman sanctuary, and later as an old Christian house of prayer. The belfry campanile, standing next to the church, as well as the marble inlay of the outside walls of the cathedral, was planned by Giotto. 463 stairs lead up to the dome of the cathedral and 414 to the belfry. Even later on, no lifts were built in either of them. The 5-floor tower is covered with colorful marble inlay. Its planned steeple was never built. After we've seen all 3 buildings, we shouldn't miss the museum of the cathedral, which shows the plans, drawings, outlines, and a scale model of the 3 buildings. The city center is divided into 4 parts by 4 perpendicular main roads. Their point of intersection was the location of the city forum of the city in the Roman era. Now we can find a marketplace here, Loggia del Mercato Nuovo, where in the morning flowers, in the afternoon clothes and gifts are sold. The Renaissance Hall, built according to Giovanni Battista del Tasso's plans, was the center of business life even in the Middle Ages. While the Cathedral Square used to be the religious center of the city, Piazza della Signoria was the center of secular power. Almost every famous event of political life of the city-state took place here. Savonarola's bonfire blazed in the square. The equestrian statue of Tuscany's first Grand Duke, Cosimo, was made by Giambologna in 1594. The reliefs on its pedestal depict the most important stages of the ruler's life. Palazzo Vecchio, before Palazzo della Signoria, is the symbol of the city. There are hardly any guidebooks or leaflets which don't contain its 94-meter-high characteristic tower. The palace was designed by Arnolfo di Cambio as a boardroom for the city's principals. Although they held a meeting only 2 months, during that time they weren't allowed to leave the palace at all. In 1540, Cosimo and his family moved into the palace, which was given the name Old Palace, Palazzo Vecchio, during this time. The roughness of its thick outside walls is toned down by the Gothic lancet windows of the floors. The battlements of the 3rd floor were used by the shooters, protecting the building. The Neptune fountain, built to be the ornamentation of the square, is slightly too monumental. Amanati's huge white marble god of the sea is not among his most successful works. The superstitious people of the Middle Ages were afraid of Neptune, who is believed to come to life at full moon and walk around the square. The figures of the group of statues made by Giambologna are better suited to the bright statues standing in the square. The young Michelangelo carved his 434-centimeter-high statue out of only 1 marble block, which as a symbol of signoria portrayed the young David with a sling in his hand as a warning that, like David who protected his people and ruled fairly, anybody who rules Florence should be equally fair and courageous to protect it, in the words of Vasari. The original statue withstood the hardships of the weather from 1504 to 1873, when a separate hall was built for it at the Galleria dell'Accademia. The main ornament of the piazza is Loggia dell'Ansi's huge open cloistered hall. In the 14th and 15th centuries, several similar halls were built where political meetings were held, but vendors were also allowed to take shelter under it if it rained. Most such buildings were walled up later on, but the Gothic early Renaissance Lanzi hasn't changed. On both sides of the stairs, lions welcome the visitors, where we can admire Cellini's Perseus on the left, and on the right, Giambologna's work called The Rape of the Sabinas. He also created the group of statues depicting Hercules and the Centaur, but the sculptor of the Meneallo statue is unknown. The Uffizi Palace was planned by Giorgio Vasari by commission of Cosimo I, who intended to place all offices of the Grand Dukedom here. Today, one of the richest art collections of not only Italy, but the whole world fills the rooms. Of course, mainly Italian masters' works can be seen, but we can also find Dutch and French painters' pieces. In his unique sarcastic style, Mark Twain wrote in his book Innocents Abroad or The New Pilgrim's Progress, "It's popular to admire the Arno. It's a great historical creek with 4 feet in the channel and some scows floating around. It would be a very plausible river if they would pump some water into it. They all call it a river, and they honestly think it's a river, do these dark and bloody Florentines. They even help out the delusion by building bridges over it. The Ponte Vecchio, the old bridge, is maybe the best-known bridge in the world. It has preserved its ancient facade, which was given by Fioravante, or, others think, by Master Gaudi. In its place, there was a crossing place during Etruscan times. The covered corridor leading over the bridge which links the Uffizi and the Pitti Palace was planned by Vasari for the sake of Prince Medici's wedding. Since 1945, it's always said about Ponte Vecchio that even the withdrawing German troops didn't blow it up, though they did all the other bridges over the Arno River. Besides the Rialto in Venice and the Ponte Vecchio, there aren't many bridges on which merchants' small houses and shops stand as in the Middle Ages. The huts of goldsmiths, silversmiths, and merchants of devotional articles are attached to each other like swallows' nests, giving a picturesque view from the river. The masters living here had the greatest silversmith statue put up in the middle of the bridge. Benvenuto Cellini was a sculptor, gold and silversmith, medalist, and a significant personality of the late Renaissance. His famous biography, which was translated into German by Goethe, spread his reputation. His adventurous, passionate life was described with exaggeration. He didn't stop short of murder driven by vanity or being wounded. Pope Paul III is alleged to have said about him that such a great artist stands above everyday laws. The most famous site on the other bank of the Arno is the Pitti Palace. The monumental building was planned by Brunelleschi by commission of the merchant and banker family with the same name. But because the glory of the world passes, an unsuccessful conspiracy made the construction come to a halt for a century, and only the Grand Duke Cosima's wife, Eleonora of Toledo, had it continued. Aminati was a better architect than sculptor and was able to solve the location of the inner courtyard and the two wings, and together with Tribolo, he contributed in designing the palace garden. The house in which the great Russian writer Dostoevsky wrote The Idiot stands opposite the gallery. In the heart of Tuscany, on a mountain peak next to Arezzo, we can find a village with a population of 1,800, Caprese di Michelangelo, where in the spring of 1475 the universal genius of Italy, Michelangelo Buonarroti, was born. The artist's father, who came from the family of Earl Canossa, was a podesta, that is, a mayor, and in accordance with his position, he lived in the small castle where a museum was set up in memory of his son. Michelangelo loved to draw when he was very young, and he wasn't yet 14 when he became one of Domenico Ghirlandaio's students. The young man, who had soon surpassed his master, was taken under the wing of Lorenzo de' Medici. The artist's first outstanding work was a statue of David, which helped him to procure several commissions. Pope Julius II had him do his too. Among the ornaments there we can find the famous statue of Moses. Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici's tombs are also decorated with fine pieces of work, and the Pietà is the main site of St. Peter's Basilica. Michelangelo was also gifted as an architect, designing among others the dome of the St. Peter's Basilica of the Vatican and the Roman Capitolium Circus, and as a painter, his frescoes in the Sistine Chapel are, of course, outstanding. In Giorgio Vasari's work, Great Masters, we can read, all craftsmen owe him an infinite and everlasting debt of gratitude, since he at one blow broke down the bands and chains which had barred the path they trod in common. Arezzo, with a population of 100,000, was an important member of the union of 12 Etruscan cities in the 3rd century BC. In the Roman Empire, it was called Aretino and was known mainly for its coral red ceramics, which was a commodity in demand. Caius Cilnius Maecenas was born in the city built in the valley between the Arno and the Tiberis, who was a friend of arts and whose name has been kept as a Maecenas. It's also the place that Guido of Arezzo lived, whom we have to thank for musical notation and the scale. There's no trace of the Roman townhouses, sanctuaries, and bathhouses, only the ruins of the amphitheater bear witness of these times. Most medieval buildings inside the city wall have remained and determine the facade of the city. The Piazza Grande was the center and marketplace of the city during the Roman era and was still so in the Middle Ages. On the west side of the slightly sloping, irregularly shaped square, we can find Santa Maria della Pieve Church, with a spectacular facade dating back to the 13th century. Its column groups are close together in 3 rows above each other, and the double circular loft of the apse represent the Roman-style version of Pisa. The simplicity of the angled bell tower is broken by 40 windows. Among the palaces flanking the square, Palazzo Tribunale and Palazzo della Fraternita can be found. In the middle of the 15th century, Piero of San Sepolcro worked here, who painted the world-famous frescoes of the San Francesco Church. The master was named Piero della Francesca after this piece of work, and he's known by this name in the history of art. Palazzo Pretorio comes from the same age. Its facade is decorated with countless chiseled stone crests. Above the gate, the coat of arms of the Medici family can be seen. In the Piazza Grande, there are crenellated stone bastions of old buildings. The Palazzo della Loggia, which closes the northern side, was designed by Vasari. He was born here, and his statue, leaning out of a crack in the wall, observes the shops under the arcade. East of the Piazza Grande, the ruins of the Medici fortress, and on the north, the cathedral of the city can be seen. Between them, Prado Park is located. Francesco Petrarca, the humanist poet for whom a statue was erected in front of the city, was also born here in 1304. He is famous mainly for his sonnets and lyrical poetry written for Laura. The cathedral is a Gothic, 3-aisled sandstone building built between the 13th and 16th centuries. The present form of its facade was attained in the 20th century. It was named after Saint Donat, whose bones rest in the shrine of the high altar. The cabinet was the joint effort of several craftsmen of Arezzo. The fresco of the left aisle was made solely by Piero della Francesca. His model was penitent Magdalene. The colorful windows from the 16th century of the right aisle are really beautiful. At the corner of the cathedral, the statue of a Grand Duke of Medici can be seen, facing the town hall. Having climbed the huge bastion towers of the medieval building with a tin roof, we can take a view of the city, with crooked streets which seem to be entangled. For those who haven't yet tired of admiring churches, there is still plenty, such as San Francesco, San Domenico, and Santa Maria della Grazia. Giorgio Vasari was born and lived in a house in the Via 20 Settembre. His book, The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, brought him great acclaim. In the preface, he wrote, "My work can be considered a mirror of my soul, a real pledge, since my sole desire is to praise my fellow craftsmen and lift them. And since they've accepted me among them, I always feel that somehow I also receive a little bit of this praise." The variety of the landscape in Tuscany catches the traveler's attention at once. 5 lives wouldn't be enough to get to know it, sighed Francis Mays, who popularized this land. And Théophile Gautier wrote the following in 1850, "An azure blue panorama of plains, mountains and valleys, scattered towns and country houses along the horizon, in an interplay of light and shadow," and it's still true. Frances Mays, an American writer and poet, didn't choose the surroundings of Cortona by chance when she was searching for a house in Tuscany. 4 of her books have been published, so her enthusiastic readers have also fallen in love with Bramisole Mansion and its neighborhood. The readers come to Cortona like pilgrims, and some of them have even bought houses here. The city was a member of the Etruscan Alliance. Its museum can be proud of important Etruscan objects, and several tombs from that time can be found in its surroundings. Cortona is surrounded by a wall and rises 500 meters above the valley. It has steep, narrow streets and stairs. Francis Meyer writes about this place as follows. The main street, Via Nazionale, is still usually referred to by locals by its older name of Ruga Piano or Level Street. It's a pedestrian zone, but the other parts of the city can't be reached by car. The streets are too narrow and steep. The lower streets are linked with the upper ones by alleys and vicolos. The center consists of two irregular piazzas, which are connected by a short street. A sensible city planner would never plan anything like this, but irrespectively of this, it's full of feeling. The town hall of the 14th century stands in the Piazza della Repubblica. While people eat ice cream on its 24 wide stairs, it's like an auditorium from where the whole square can be seen. Flanking the square, there are harmonious buildings, the unity interrupted only by the mouth of 3 streets. These lead from the city gate to here. The square and streets are full of life. It's wonderful that there are no cars here. I walked to Piazza Signorelli, which was named after one of Cortona's famous people. The tables on the terrace of 2 cafes extend as far as the square. I always look at the lonely stone lion of Florence, which passes time on top of a column. It's impossible to arrive at the square too late. We can always find somebody here sipping a cup of coffee before the clock strikes midnight. Everybody, however fit they are, is short of breath by the time they reach the heights of the city, but it's worth walking there even in the hot sun at noon. The traces of the arches of the one-time cloister can be found on the side of San Francesco Church, which is always closed. At 33 Via Berrettini, a memorial plaque calls attention to Pietro Berrettini, who was born here. I found out that he was Pietro di Cortona. We reach some shady piazzas, old houses with terraces. Small gardens can be seen in front of us. Each street is clean here, and so are the houses. If they find even a very small empty place, they'll plant tomatoes or lettuce there. In the pots, geraniums and hydrangeas bloom, sometimes growing to be as big as a bush, and somehow they always have pink flowers. Having left Piazza Garibaldi, all Italian cities have a square with this name, we can be assured that this city is one of the most civilized places in the world. There's a kilometer-long shady park next to an area planted with flowers. Local people visit this place every day. The park suggests timelessness. The people's clothes, the size of the trees change, but otherwise it could be some 100 years ago. I look down to see how high I am. Val di Chiane lies under us like a fan. In clear weather, Lake Trasimeno, Monte San Savino, and Montepulciano can be seen on the horizon. They used to be able to send smoke signals. There's a big fiesta tonight. Come along, too. Giacomo Puccini was Elmicada Ponchielli's student at the Conservatory of Milano. All of his work was inspired by love. In the focus of all his operas, there was a woman admired by him. Mimi from La Bohème, Tosca, Cho-Cho San and Madame Butterfly, or Turandot. He fell in love with all his characters and mourned all of them. He met Elvira in Milano, with whom he spent all his life, although he was able to marry her only 17 years after they first met. They moved to Torre del Lago, a peaceful small village on a lake, where they found happiness. Although Puccini traveled throughout the world during his life, he always returned here. He reached real success after writing La Bohème, based on his own youth. A man of extremes, he lived a self-destructive way of life. He skyrocketed to fabulous wealth out of the deepest poverty. Siena was built in the heart of Tuscany on 3 levels, which rise out of the surrounding hills. The red clay, Terra di Siena, is favorable to Chianti Classico grapes, which give a beautiful ruby red wine. As far as the eye can see, there are vineyards and olive groves, which have made the city rich. It may have been named after a Roman colony called Sena Julia, though as legend has it, it was named after Romulus's nephew, Senus, and that's why the city coat of arms contains the Roman female wolf. Saint Catherine and Saint Bernardino were also born in the city. Religious mysticism left its mark on the city for centuries. The art treasures and paintings of its many churches made in this spirit. The city competed and fought with Florence during the entire Middle Ages, declaring its separation and only coming under the rule of Tuscan Grand Dukes residing in Florence at the end of the 16th century. The city has preserved its Gothic style. The streets leading to the cathedral and the shell-shaped main square, Il Campo, the descending small streets, the narrow stairs, the gilded gates, the quiet squares, and the typical form of the burnt red brick buildings. Regardless of which pedestrian zone we pass through, suddenly the most beautiful medieval square of Tuscany appears before us. The irregular semicircular sloping area gives us a magical experience. On the red brick cover laid down in a fishbone design, rays of white stripes direct our eyes to the town hall, the Palazzo Pubblico. It's unusual that the building is located neither in the center of the square nor on its highest point, but on the contrary. This form-breaking solution makes the view unforgettable. And our souls stay in Siena, which opens its heart to us, declares the inscription on the town gate. The word palio means flag. And it's not only in Siena that this traditional medieval horse race with its black and gold flag is held, but the one in Siena is the most famous. It's a Mediterranean fiesta with real atmosphere, and shouldn't be missed. It's held twice a year on the 2nd of July and 16th of August. A magnificent pageant precedes the race when teams, horses and riders, of 10 districts appear in costume. Then the race begins, in which the jockeys ride bareback. The race itself consists of 3 laps of the Piazza del Campo. The town hall is as asymmetric as the piazza itself. The 3-part brick building dating back to the 13th century, ornate with lancet windows, crowned with battlements, is like a knight's castle. Its 102-meter-high belfry rising on its left side is very similar to the power of Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. The loggia-like chapel was built on the occasion of the end of the plague of 1348. Opposite this, the Fonte Gaia gurgles at the highest point of the square. The fountain is the end of a 25-kilometer-long water conduit. The statues and reliefs are copies of Jacopo della Quercia's work. We don't need to go far to see the originals, which are in the City Museum in the Palazzo Pubblico. On the balcony of some of the houses flanking the small square, cafes can be found, from which we can watch the coming and going on Il Campo. Like in the brick-covered square in front of the Pitti Palace, people sit down on the ground here too, as if they were having a picnic. They sunbathe, listen to music, eat, relax, and read while the pigeons, common in the Italian piazzas, trot around them. Although all the medieval palaces flanking the pedestrian zones have their own story, tourists don't usually pay much attention to them. They all hurry to the cathedral. The cathedral stands on a Z-shaped square. It was built in Romanesque style on the site of an ancient Minervan sanctuary, but before it could be finished, it was converted into Gothic style. Its facade was planned by Giovanni Pisano. The side elevation and the belfry have retained their medieval shape and black and white marble stripes. The 3-aisle inner space is colorful and monumental. How monumental would it be now if the Sienese had succeeded in building Italy's biggest church, compared to which this one would have been only a modest side aisle? They actually started to build it, but the plague, which took 30,000 people, threw cold water on the gigantic scheme. They didn't demolish the walls they'd built so far. That's where they set up the museum of the cathedral. After the epidemic, the city was only able to build the small chapel of the town hall. Steep stairs lead to the baptistery under the cathedral. It was originally planned to be a crypta. Its statues were made by Jacopo della Quercia, who also designed Fonte Gaia, Ghiberti, and Donatello. Besides the treasury and gallery, we must remember to go to the terrace, from where there's a beautiful view of the city. Siena's inner city has been a pedestrian zone since 1959. On the ground floor of the Gothic palaces, the typical goods of Tuscany are sold in the shops. It's worth stopping for a minute in front of the Palazzo Tattucci, especially for businessmen, brokers, and other bankers, because it's the oldest still operating bank of the world. The Archaeological Museum can be found in a building that used to be a hospital built in 1225. The municipal archives are located in the Palazzo Piccolomini, while the Palazzo Buonsignori is home to the National Gallery. The 700 pictures painted on panels and exhibited here give a total review of Sienese painting between the 12th and 16th centuries. Tuscany's 300-kilometer-long coast spreads from La Spezia to Civitavecchia, and it has the same facilities as other known resorts in eastern Italy. There are tiny islands along the coast like scattered coins at the bottom of the Trevi fountain. Two of them sound very familiar. Capraia, that is Goat Island, was Garibaldi's refuge. The other is Isola di Montecristo, after which Dumas' hero got his name. The biggest island is a 223-square-kilometer Elba, which brings the name Napoleon to mind, although the small island is worth visiting not only for this reason. The most western point of the sea, Tira, is only 50 kilometers away from the harbor of Bastia in Corsica, but while Corsica belongs to France, Elba belongs to Italy, moreover, to Tuscany. Since 1996, Parco Nazionale dell'Arcipelago has belonged to Tuscany. Elba has a population of 30,000, a part of which commutes to work to the mainland. Between Piombino and Portoferraio, the main port of the island, ferries run from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. every day. On the island, scrogs and pinia woods alternate with vineyards and orchards. Craggy cliffs alternate with sandy beaches. The landscape is similar to Sardinia, where people try to preserve the intact island, like here. There are no skyscrapers and hotel complexes of concrete and glass along the long beaches, but there are evocative, homey small hotels and guest houses, nice views, clean air, and quiet. Although Elba was inhabited in the Middle Ages, or even before, there aren't any norogs, in other words, round megalithic stone buildings, which we can find in Sardinia. Tiny ancient villages are tucked away on the craggy slopes. Only Portoferraio is a more sizable settlement. Tourist boats and ferries arrive at its harbor. It's easy for anybody who's been to Corsica or Sardinia to imagine the atmosphere of the capital of Elba. Let's see what's been written on the internet by a traveler who regularly visits the island. Portoferraio conquers the traveler with the directness of the sea. You wouldn't need anything else to relax. The water and the view of the sea make you forget about your fatigue. Walk around, look into the small streets, and walk up the hill, because while you observe the panorama of the endless sea around you, you have the feeling you've been there for hours, listening to the quietly rippling sea and watching the sunbeams reflecting on the waves. A crooked road leads to the fortress called Rocca del Monte Volterra, which is worth visiting because of its panorama. The whole of Elba lies at our feet, and the other high point of the island, Montecatini, seems to be reachable. It lies 1,019 meters above sea level, and you can reach its top by cable car. Monte Aurelio on the south is also suitable for a pleasant walk. You can roam the country on horseback or mountain bike. One of the most tiring paths takes you from Napoleon's house, Villa San Martino, to Coloreciso, but it's worth it, because you'll be rewarded with unforgettable lands and enticing panoramas. Wherever the vantage point, Elba is beautiful. And those who would like to bathe surrounded by a fabulous environment should visit the southeast beaches of the island. The leg from Punta del Ripalti to Lacona del Golfo di Stella is full of tiny bays, sandy and pebbly beaches, and wonderful Mediterranean bushes and flowers, the smell of which is dazzlingly strong, especially in May. Capoliveri is attractive with its wonderful pedestrian zones, evocative small streets, many tiny shops, and private restaurants where you can have a delicious dinner in such a pleasant atmosphere that you never want to leave your table. But it's worth leaving because the night is long with 1,000 tiny miracles, the light of the sea at night, and the familiar and thrilling smell of summer nights. Exiled to the island of Elba, Napoleon, as it is difficult to give up conquering, invaded the neighboring tiny island of Pianosa, and then he seemed not to be interested in politics any longer. He sometimes checked the battalion and military station permitted him, but for the remainder of the time, he was involved in his economic affairs. He had the local iron mines put in order, and he found a lot of other things to do. He was 45. He was edged out of history in the best age of manhood. He wouldn't have been Napoleon if he'd given in immediately. The soldiers placed at the emperor's disposal were stationed at the fortress of Portoferraio. First, Napoleon settled in a small, modest house 3 kilometers from here. It could be reached on foot along the top of the bastion wall. But he spent the largest part of the 10 months here in a villa a few kilometers away, which was worthier to his position. The Allies always watched the island of Elba with ships, and meanwhile they happily started to rearrange Europe. The pleasant mood of the winners at a congress in Vienna was disturbed by a courier. Napoleon has returned. Sándor Fekete wrote in a biography of Napoleon, Napoleon was only superficially involved in governing Elba. Actually, he got news from France by his spies and couriers. His 100-day return was ended by the Battle of Waterloo. The emperor learned his lesson, and 100 days after his disembarkation on the 22nd of June, 1815, he abdicated the throne. This time, he was exiled to a farther place, the island of St. Helena, where he died 6 years later. In our age, it's sailors who explore the beauty of the island of Elba. Sailors with yachts and sailboats, who restlessly sailing from island to island, from bay to bay, on the waves of the Tira and Ligure Sea, look for new beauties and adventures, just as Odysseus did. The lesser-known Volterra provides travelers with a pleasant surprise. The atmosphere of its pedestrian zones emerges especially at sunset. Small tables are put up in front of restaurants and cafes, the lights above the streets are turned on, music plays, and the shops welcome customers till late evening. Tourists walk up and down and fill the alleyways winding along the ancient walls with life. The copy of an Etruscan statue called Evening Shadows is for sale everywhere. Volterra was also the member of the Alliance of 12 Etruscan cities, just like Cortona, and its location is also similar. We can approach the city built 555 meters high on a mountainside eroded by wind and rain. The remains of the Etruscan city wall and gate are eye-catching, but Volterra is dominated by the huge Medici fortress which determines the city's atmosphere. Palazzo de' Priori, the town hall, was built in 1208, almost 300 years before America was discovered. Opposite it, the Palazzo del Pretorio is slightly younger. Though Palazzo Inconti is from the 15th century, it doesn't spoil the harmony of the image. We wouldn't think that the cathedral with its simple facade concealed such fine pieces of work. Its statues and frescoes were made by the artists of the Florentine school, whose work can also be seen at the gallery of Palazzo Minucci. In Volterra, we also encounter alabaster polishing workshops. In some of them, we can even try to polish, but don't get upset if you don't manage at first. The shops offer fine gifts. The Roman Empire invaded the area of Italy first. Then, after defeating Carthage, it included the basin of the Mediterranean Sea and soon the majority of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Wherever a new city was built, they had fixed elements. circuses, theaters, amphitheaters, baths, sanctuaries and churches, market halls, and forums. Roman people learned a lot from the Etruscans, but they didn't always live in peace with them. The invaded Etruscan cities were rebuilt according to the Roman examples. The remains of their huge buildings can be seen at many locations even now, 2,000 years later. But in Volterra, only the amphitheater remained, and it may not have been found if some of its stones hadn't surfaced after a landslide. Who knows how much is hidden in the mountains besides the nicely restored Roman stadium? If we look further in the distance, we can see the peak of Monte Volteo. On the neighboring hills, there are 2 monasteries where visitors are accepted after having registered in advance. In the valleys, there are popular baths like Cinciano or Petriolo. San Gimignano is also called the Tuscan Manhattan. Seen from far away, its various high angular medieval towers are similar to American skyscrapers. There's no other Tuscan settlement in which the old town has so many towers. What all could there have been in the 14th and 15th centuries when allegedly 72 such buildings were erected here? Each one was the fortified residence of a family, which is not exactly proof of good relationships. The small town with a population of 7,000 is becoming more and more popular with tourists. The Estate San Gimignanese Music Festival takes place in the square in front of the cathedral every summer. It attracts a lot of visitors and not only foreigners. Italian people love traveling, and they also travel around their country from one end to the other. On weekends, we can meet lots of caravans with families and friends, and tourist buses on the highways. Half of the visitors of Italian festivals, religious and secular alike, are always Italian, but they may come from the other end of the country. Inside the city wall, almost nothing has changed since Dante came here to enlist the inhabitants of San Gimignano as Florence's ally with a speech made at the town hall. It's the easiest to approach the inner city from the car park in front of Porta San Giovanni, where buses stop. On foot, we can reach Piazza del Cisterna in 15 minutes, the name of which speaks for itself. The picturesque small square joins Piazza del Duomo. The cathedral, also called Collegiata, was sanctified in 1148 by Pope Eugene II. The frescoes were made by Domenico Ghirlandaio 300 years later, but we can also see frescoes by Lippo Memmi, Taddeo di Bartoli, and Benozzo Gozzoli. Construction on the town hall opposite the cathedral began at the end of the 13th century, according to plans by Arnolfo di Cambio. Its tower is the 54-meter-high Torre Grossa. A higher tower wasn't allowed at that time. If we find it open, it's worth going up to the top, from which various views open upon the old city, surrounded by the ancient wall and the colorful world in the distance. The town hall operates according to its original function, but is partially a museum as well. Perhaps people in office need less space than their ancient ancestors. In the gallery on the second floor, works by Filippino Lippi, Ghirlandaio, Pinturicchio, and Gozzoli can be seen, and the frescoes were made by Lippo Memmi. The atmosphere of the intact inner courtyard suggests that time has stopped. From the square, we can pass through Via San Matteo, flanked by medieval palaces, to San Agostino Church, the charm of which, besides Gozzoli's fine work, is mainly Benedetto de Maiano's marble altar. The ancient hotels of San Gimignano can be recommended to anybody wanting to stay in the city for a night. Don't forget to taste the famous wine of the neighborhood, the Vernaccia. Colle di Valdelsa is one of the walled medieval towns, something that Tuscany, Umbria, and Lazio, but even the French Provence have in common. Its former archiepiscopal palace is a luxurious hotel today. Leonardo da Vinci, the personification of the universal genius, the Renaissance man, was born in the small village of Vinci between Pisa and Florence. His father, Ser Piero, worked as a village notary, and his mother, Caterina, was a servant of a well-to-do family in the village. He finished his elementary studies in his hometown. In 1469, he traveled to Florence, where he joined Andrea de Verrocchio's studio as an apprentice. The young painter's fame spread rapidly. For years, he was given numerous commissions, the most important of which is the fresco in the Santa Maria della Grazia monastery, The Last Supper, which he finished in 1498. 4 years later, he hired himself out to the Cesare Borgia and followed him to the Romanian siege. His known sketches of fortresses and war machines come from this period. In 1503 in Florence, he started to paint his masterpiece, the Mona Lisa, La Gioconda in Italian. After finishing the work, he turned to anatomy and geology with renewed interest and began to study these subjects in Milan. Pope Leo X invited him to Rome, where he spent 3 years. In 1517, the French king invading Milan invited him to his court. Leonardo accepted his invitation and moved to Clos-Luc near Amboise. He spent 2 years here. In 1519, he became ill and died. He left his heritage to his students and friend, the painter Malesherbes. Montecatini Terme is the most famous non-sea resort of Tuscany, maybe even of whole Italy. We can enjoy its thermal waters and bathhouses and well rooms built in Art Nouveau style. Its small hotels tucked away in parks and cafes with nostalgic atmosphere have a monarchic feeling, as if we were in Bad Ischl, Opatya, or Carlo Vivari. But we're in Tuscany, so there's something extra to the bath places. By cable railway, we can reach Montecatini Alto in 10 minutes, from where we can look down on the resort lying below. Many bath guests stay here in the area surrounded by the medieval wall so that they can spoil themselves in the lukewarm spa in the evenings or listen to music on the terraces. From Piazzale Barbano e Giovannetti Square, where the lift arrives, Piazza Giusti can be reached in 2 minutes. The main square of Montecatini Alto is full of outdoor cafes and restaurants where delicious dishes are served on tables laid with Tuscan ceramics. Let's take a short walk in the 4 to 5 neighboring steep streets and enjoy the view from above. The magnificent panorama is enchanting, bursting in on us from here. Half of Tuscany can be seen, in clear weather, even a narrow strip of the sea. The towns lying below are as if they weren't towns, but a huge square with tiny houses and streets. If we take the same walk in the evening, we can see millions of lights and feel incredible harmony and peace. The experience is guaranteed to last. Pisa used to be a world sea power. The city lies only 9 kilometers from the point where the Arno River flows into the sea. The former harbor with the remains of 20 ships was found behind the cathedral by archaeologists only recently. Now it's being discussed where to display this group of unique findings. But Pisa not only lives in the past. Besides tourism, industry and trade are also important in the city with a population of 100,000. For example, the famous Vespa scooter was developed and manufactured here. On the emerald green lawn of Prato dei Miracoli, 3 snow-white marble buildings stand: the Baptistery, the Cathedral, and Campanile, otherwise known as the Leaning Tower. Battistero is the best example of how our eyes can deceive us. The round building is just as high as the Leaning Tower. The building was designed by Master Diotisalvi in Romanesque style. Its second floor in Gothic style is the work of Nicola and Giovanni Pisano. The belfry of the cathedral, done by Bossano da Pisa and started in 1172, would be special even if it stood straight, as campaniles at that time were square, not round-shaped. Like the cathedral, this building stood for the Pisan Romanesque style. Its 6 floors are decorated with arcades with columns. The arcades on each level, except for the top floor, are without barriers. The inclination of the tower was visible after the first floor had been built. Perhaps an underground spring washed out the soil and construction was stopped due to it. It's interesting that the already built floors weren't demolished, but construction was continued from here and finished in the 14th century. The highest point of the tower is 55 meters. Its deviation from the vertical is 4.5 meters at the top. Galilei did his experiments of free fall from the top of this tower. The appearance of the cathedral matches the baptistery and the tower perfectly. Its construction was started in 1063 according to the plans of Busquetto. 55 years later, it was sanctified, but it was further developed even in the 16th century. Its main facade was an example to follow when building other churches, for example, in the neighboring Lucca. The ground floor of the cathedral is divided by 7 arches. The gate to Giambologna's workshop is really beautiful, although the original, which was made by Bonanno and was destroyed in a firestorm, was even more spectacular. The bronze gate of the chapel of the right transept is an original work by Bonanno, so we can decide which one we find more beautiful. The facade is decorated by 4 rows of arcades. The semicircles above the gate reveal mosaics. The inner side of the church has 5, on the beam 3 naves. Though some very beautiful statues and frescoes survived the fire in 1595 and can be found here, art historians think the church attracts us not with its art treasures or ornaments, but the perfect harmony of its architectural proportions. Giovanni Pisano's original pulpit was almost totally destroyed by the fire. It took centuries for the technique of restoration to reach the level where it could be rescued. Since 1926, it can be seen in its full glory again. The pulpit, decorated with statues and reliefs depicting medieval symbols, is decorated in a Baroque way, so it exceeds the Pisan style of the age. In the left nave, the great late patron of the city-state, the German Emperor, Henry VII, lies. His richly carved stone sarcophagus was made by Tino da Carmiano. Some of the frescoes of the ceiling survived the fire, the rest were repainted according to original plans. Pisa had an excellent university, even in the Middle Ages. Today, its 11 faculties have 30,000 students who bring life to the city from autumn to spring. During the summer holiday, the noise of colorful groups of tourists are echoed by the white marble walls. We can consider Lucca to be the Cinderella of tourism. Travelers look at Venice, Florence, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and often missing this city, they scuttle off to Rome. But it has so many beauties and interesting things if we get to know it. Lucca was an independent republic from the early Middle Ages to 1840. It bought its independence from the German Roman Emperor for a lot of money, so it was never under the rule of the Medici family. Napoleon granted it the rank of dukedom, but he didn't rule it. Instead, he made his sister Eliza the ruler of the city. He lived his life in his palace built outside the city walls with his lovers, which, according to rumors, included the young Paganini. The only evidence of Eliza's rule is that the main square of the city, shaded by sycamores, is called Piazza Napoleon. After having bought their independence for so much money, they wanted to keep it. In the 1600s, the city was surrounded by a 12-meter high and 12-meter wide brick wall. The wall was fortified with 11 bastions and protected by a moat. It had another use. It protected Lucca from flooding of the Serchio River. The Bastion Alley has become the favorite of the locals, where they like sitting on the benches, taking their dogs for a walk, or pushing their prams. Finally, the city became a part of the Tuscan Principality in 1840. The cathedral from the 10th century was named after St. Martin, whose statue stands in the foyer on the right of the middle arcade and has been refurbished several times. The Roman-style belfry with battlements rises like a bastion on the right side of the facade. The altar picture, as painted by Fra Bartolomeo, the sarcophagus of the middle transept with a statue of a reclining woman who died at a young age, was made by Quercia. The most valued relic of the church was placed in a separate, octagonally shaped building. It's called Volto Santo, is highly revered, and its origin is dated back to Christ by the church, but according to archaeological investigations, it was made in the 11th century. For centuries, the wealth of Lucca has been based on the sale of clothes made here, but the sale of the traditional Tuscan agricultural products is gaining more and more in importance. The marketplace of the city, Piazza di Mercato, wasn't created traditionally, and it doesn't lie where the market of the Roman city lay. Here, the oval of the amphitheater was closed by 3, later 5-story buildings, on the ground floors of which elegant shops had been opened. Lucca's churches imitate the Pisan cathedral, but they're more ornate. When we feel that we've seen the most beautiful one, a more decorative one comes to view. The name of San Michele in Foro shows that it was built in the middle of the city, on the place of the Roman Forum. On top of the frontispiece, the name-giving Archangel St. Michael opens his wings. The glazed terracotta relief is Robbia's work, while the transept painting is by Filippino Lippi. The specialty of Lucca's churches is that the columns of their facade are different from each other. The masters gave vent to their fantasy, allowing more variation than just the traditional Doric, Ionian, or Corinthian columns. Some are twisted, covered with acanthus leaves, carved atlases, jagged, oval, and polygonal columns. One of Lucca's most famous sites is Puccini's birthplace. The great composer's father also composed operas and oratorios for the Cathedral of Lucca. As the young Giacomo's talent was shown at an early age, the whole family supported him. They lived in poverty, and the parents didn't live to see their son be not only a known composer, but also a rich man. In the neighborhood of Viareggio and the pine groves, vacationers rest in the shade. The shady camping sites are lined up one after another, while along the long beach there are plenty of comfortable hotels. Some years ago, the resorts in the eastern part of Italy, Jesolo, Rimini, and Riccione, were popular. By now, the western part, Brazilian Beach, has caught up with them. On the motorway of the coast, there are endless lines of cars. On the walkways, colorful t-shirts, beach scarves, straw hats, sunglasses, shorts, and bikinis go on parade. If nobody else came here, the coastal hotels and motels would be filled with local people and the city dwellers of Rome and Florence. But foreigners also come in large numbers. The beach is loud with German, French, and English words. Foreigners also arrived here years ago, and there were a lot of famous people among them. Shelley passed away here. Aldous Huxley and Thomas Mann also came here to write. Böcklin came to paint. The sailing port is not only the most beloved place of the Mediterranean Sea, but also the second biggest one. At the end of July, the Viareggio Bastia Brigata begins. Carnival takes place in February, but the decorated cars can be seen at the car hall in the Viale Marco Polo. The walkway with palm trees along the coastline is flanked by villas, cafes, restaurants, and elegant boutiques in Art Nouveau style. In North Tuscany, not far from the coast of La Spezia, the famous Carrara can be found, surrounded by the marble mountains of Apuana. There are lots of great buildings, tombs, reliefs, and statues made of this noble material. Seeing the trucks carrying surprisingly large blocks for various building sites, stonemasons, and sculptors, it's incredible that they haven't carried away the whole mountain, because the exploitation has been going on since ancient times. 30 years ago, Tibor Fait wrote, "The valuable stone is exploited on the sides of the cliffs, on the surface, and is slid down the steeps. Following the blocks, a white marble powder is deposited, which seems to be snow from afar. In the beds of the valley, the marble is sawed into various sized blocks and carried away by trucks, rail, or ship from the harbor of nearby cities. The whole mountainside lives from marble." The marble mines, cava, can be approached on well-designated roads from the city center. Along the road, we can find marble processing plants and small gift shops. The bridges were built in the 19th century to make transportation easier. Balls, eggs, chess sets, mortars, vases, cutting boards, railings, sinks, and statues are made of the various colored, beautifully grained marble. At some places, the huge blocks are cut out in front of us with saws cooled with water. We can see stonemasons working. Anybody who wants to see more than this should look at the Marble Museum in Marina di Carrara next to the yacht port. The neighborhood is full of harbors, but nowadays there are more luxurious boats than freight ships. The 30-kilometer-long beach of Versilia has been occupied by swimmers. Such lovely resorts can be found here as Marina di Massa, Forte dei Marmi, or Sarzana. In Tuscany, local art gets inspiration from the beauty of the countryside, its lights, landscapes, stone buildings, and typical facades. Lights. The ripples and waves of the water reflect light in 1,000 ways. The color of the sky changes all the time, but at noon it's the same blue as in the morning. The sun disperses all the clouds. Peace itself lives in this land. Is the overflowing energy of Italian people due to the light?